From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden calls for an exception to the Senate filibuster for abortion legislation as the Supreme Court wraps up its term with rulings on immigration and tribal sovereignty. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Alicia Finley. Happy Friday to you both. President Biden today met with Democratic governors and was responding to the Supreme Court's decision on Roe v. Wade. And here's a piece of what he said.
Congress is going to have to act to codify the Roe into federal law. As I said yesterday, the filibuster should not stand in the way of us being able to do that. But right now, we don't have the votes in the Senate to change the filibuster at the moment. That means we need 2 more votes now. Not now, when we vote, probably after November, more senators and House majority elected in November to get this bill to my desk.
Kim, what do you make of this? It seems to me it certainly is the president trying to raise the stakes of the November midterm elections.
As with everything in Washington, there's the politics question and the policy question. It strikes me this is a bad move on both levels. I know that the White House is under a lot of pressure, especially from its base, to look as though it's being more aggressive in its reaction to the Supreme Court's Roe decision. But calling for this, first of all, it's not going to work because the same senators who have opposed changing the filibuster in the past, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Arizona's Kyrsten Sinema, have already come out and said that their position remains unchanged on this anyway. I think that there's also some real risk to Democrats of elevating, nationalizing the abortion issue. I know they hope that it might bring out more of their voters, but there's every chance that it can also motivate voters on the other side. So there's that. Then on the policy side, this is actually even more worrisome because this whole argument, well, let's just have the filibuster, some exceptions for it, is nonsense. If you have an exception for this, or as the Democrats have also said, also an exception for voting rights, these key issues. As soon as Republicans take over, they're going to have their own exceptions too. It's basically the beginning of the end for the filibuster, and Joe Biden ought to be more honest about that.
Well, I agree with that assessment, and what proves the case is that this is the second exception that the president is calling for. But even if you take him on those terms, it seems to me that it's a bad deal, Alicia, because if an exception to the filibuster can be used to codify Roe v. Wade in a Democratic administration, why couldn't that exception be used in a Republican administration to have a national abortion ban? Or the same question on voting rights. The Democrats want to use a filibuster exception to expand mail voting in all 50 states. And it seems to me a Republican administration could use the same exception to the filibuster to impose a national voter ID law. And Biden is a smart guy. I don't quite understand why he isn't reckoning with the fact that Democrats are not going to be permanently in power here.
So I think President Biden is getting a lot of blowback from his base and a lot of pressure to do something. Obviously, right now, with Democrats only with 50 seats, he can't pass a bill that would codify Roe v. Wade. Essentially, as you mentioned, blowing up the filibuster, because this wouldn't just be a one-time thing. I do think that he realizes that politics shift. Democrats may be in power now, but who knows, in 2, 4, 6 years, Republicans could control both chambers of our Congress as well as the White House, and they could pass laws that would ban abortion nationwide, which would probably, both of them arguably are unconstitutional. But who knows what else Republicans would like to do, codify right-to-work legislation nationally. They would no doubt actually like to pass their own voting reform laws to perhaps require voter ID. So I think President Biden does acknowledge or realize that reality, but nonetheless, he needs to come out. He feels pressure from his base to come out and nonetheless support at least a quote-unquote one-time exception for the filibuster, or as you say, 2-time exception for the filibuster, to show that he's at least, taking a position. And I think he feels probably safe because Sinema and Manchin have pushed back against that, so it probably won't pass. So he can basically say that he's for it, even while it has no chance of passing.
But put aside the policy arguments for a moment. I mean, it's the yo-yo effect that I think would be so potentially dangerous of getting rid of the filibuster, which is a moderating influence. And I get that both parties really love the filibuster when they're out of power, and they really hate the filibuster when they're in power. But without it, I mean, what you could end up with is Democrats in power for 4 or 6 or 8 years and codifying Roe v. Wade, doing union card check, expanding mail voting, running the whole table there. And then Republicans taking power for 4 or 6 or 8 years and reversing everything that Democrats just did and doing concealed carry reciprocity nationwide, making every state into a right to work state. And the back and forth, Kim, I don't think would be good for the Republic. And if you think that each election is the most important election of our lifetimes, goes the old joke. But if you think that's the way it is now, I mean, wow, wait until one party can do anything that it wants with a bare majority with no input from the minority party.
Right. And don't take our worry for it. Go back to the founders. Obviously, there's long been talk ever since the beginning of this republic about how we set up these two chambers to work in different ways. And the Senate was supposed to be the cooling saucer, the organization, the body that calmed down the hot tea sent over from the House. And for many, many decades, the filibuster has been an integral component of that, requiring the Senate to stop, take a look, and also to get those 60 votes so that what legislation finally ends up on the president's desk usually requires some level of bipartisan compromise and therefore will be more lasting. In fact, the entire point of this is that we want a chamber that is forcing the parties to think long and hard about legislation, because founders did not want Congress to be a place that was tossing out laws right and left. It was meant to be a limited government. You get rid of the filibuster, and then we come much closer to the parliamentary system that we ditched when we left England, where that kind of environment, as you said, exactly is what happens, where every party that can come in just reverses with a bare majority what came before it, and there's no stability. And a lot of people have pointed out that this is one of the beauties of America that actually provides for its incredibly robust economy and less of a level of civil discontent because of the certainty that comes with a Washington that isn't willy-nilly changing the laws every time there's a new leader in the White House.
But one irony of this is that President Biden is now calling for exceptions to the filibuster to codify Roe v. Wade, which was overturned in part because Democrats made exceptions to the filibuster. And just to recall some of that history, the filibuster used to apply to judicial appointees, including Supreme Court appointees. And in 2013, the Democratic Senate Majority Leader was Harry Reid, and he used the nuclear option to get some appellate judges appointed. And the prescient statement that Mitch McConnell, the minority leader at the time, prescient statement he made was, "You'll regret this, and you may regret this a lot sooner than you think." And it wasn't 5 years later that Republicans were back in power. President Trump was in the White House. He appointed his first Supreme Court Justice, Neil Gorsuch. This was 2018. And Mitch McConnell returned the favor by ending the filibuster for Supreme Court justices. And as we know, what ended up happening was President Trump got 2 more appointees. Those 3 justices, conservative justices, were all confirmed without the filibuster. And all 3 of those justices were in the majority to end Roe v. Wade. And it's striking to me that Democrats don't seem to have taken any lesson from that or what might have happened. Because, Alicia, if Harry Reid had not done what he did, I don't think, to be honest, that Mitch McConnell would have done it. And some of those appellate judges would not have been confirmed. And maybe President Trump would have had to negotiate or pick a more centrist judge instead of Neil Gorsuch and the appointees that came after him. And it's hard to do counterfactual history, Alicia, but it is notable to me that there is no reflection on what actually happened to get us to this point.
Oh, I think that's right. And I think it made it a lot easier for Mitch McConnell to justify killing filibuster for Supreme Court decisions based on what Harry Reid did. You know, we on the page have long had arguments, going back more than a decade about this, and noting also that Democrats considered killing the filibuster to pass Obamacare, but actually instead went through budget reconciliation for the very kind of reason that we've been discussing, is that it could then embolden Republicans to pass other kinds of legislation that they oppose. and would really kind of destabilize our democracy. One other thing I just wanted to recall on Kim's point is Justice Gorsuch's concurrence in the West Virginia v. EPA decision on Thursday, which mentioned that part of the constitutional design is to make it hard to pass legislation. The West Virginia EPA decision involved the Obama Clean Power Plan, and one of the criticisms is that it's just too hard to pass legislation nowadays, and therefore the regulators need to have more discretion and more latitude to essentially write regulations. But this was essentially a feature of the Constitution and how the framers intended. The Congress did not want the political tides and democratic forces, the majoritarian rule that does exist in some other countries. They wanted a more deliberative process. And so this was actually a feature of the Constitution rather than a bug.
One more question, this one on the politics here. Kim, Biden is framing this as an issue specifically for the November elections. He says, we need to get 2 more Senate seats so that we can do this filibuster exception. And do you think that helps him in some of these Senate races? There are candidates, I think, in both Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, Democratic candidates for Senate who've called for ending the filibuster. And President Biden seems to think that this will energize their campaigns, but won't it energize the opposition just as much or more?
Exactly. And in my view, Republicans have been a bit slow to make this a major campaign theme, or at least to single it out as a more important campaign theme. They tend to throw it into their long litany of warnings that they hand out to voters about things that will happen if Democrats retain control or if Democrats are able to continue their agenda. They're going to raise your taxes and pack the court and eliminate the filibuster. It really needs to be highlighted and isolated as an incredible threat, because I do actually think that that would be exceptionally motivating, in particular to independent voters who do not want to see this happen. If you look at the polls on those proposals to end the filibuster or to pack the court, they're not popular, and independents in particular reject that kind of an approach. I think you do that, and this could even be a single issue for many voters, the kind of thing that drives them out to the polls. So I think this is a dangerous game Democrats are playing, so openly broadcasting their intentions. And it raises the stakes when the president says it as well. He has up to now distanced himself some from those proposals and posed himself more as a moderate and institutionalist when it comes to the Senate, having served many years there himself. But when he is openly calling for it, it becomes the stated position of the Democratic Party, and it therefore becomes much more real in voters' eyes. So I do not consider this smart politics.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. You're listening to Potomac Watch from the Wall Street Journal.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. On the Supreme Court's final day of this term, it issued 2 decisions. One is the EPA case that Alicia mentioned and Paul discussed on yesterday's podcast, and the other is called Biden v. Texas. And if I'm framing it right, the Supreme Court here has allowed the Biden administration to rescind the Trump remain in Mexico policy for immigration. But as in a lot of these administrative law cases, it gets a little bit tangled from there. So, Alicia, can you give us a broad sense of what this case means and what it's about?
Well, so what happened here is that, you recall, Trump's Remain in Mexico policy, which was based on a provision in the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1996 law and amendments to it that were actually intended to deal with a surge of illegal immigration. And recall also that Joe Biden at the time in the Senate voted for that law. So this law included some couple provisions that one said that the administration or whoever was in the White House at the time or in going forward shall detain basically any illegal or people who are not qualified to be admitted. And it gave the administration also an outlet to essentially may return them to Mexico. And I'm just going to emphasize those words shall and may. The issue over actually last couple of decades is that the administrations have not had the capacity to detain all of the illegal immigrants who've been apprehended at the border as well as in the country. So in many cases, they've been just released in the country. And this is the quote-unquote problem of catch and release. The government catches them at the border, processes them, but doesn't have the space to actually detain them while their hearings, either an asylum hearing or an immigration hearing, depending on whether they claim asylum, takes place. That process can take a couple of years. So they release them into the country. Trump tried to reduce the incentives to immigrate illegally and claim asylum by invoking this provision in the law that allows the president to return unauthorized immigrants to Mexico. Biden, when he came into office, he rescinded this policy, partly because there was a lot of pressure from his base. Progressives really don't like it. And I just want to add in the background, both Trump and Biden, since 2020, since the pandemic began, they really were relying more on a CDC authority, Title 42, which allows the government to automatically expel illegal immigrants, people who cross the border illegally back to Mexico or the country where they came from. So the Remain in Mexico hasn't really been in effect for the last 2 years. But the issue was, the public health emergency and therefore Title 42, in my opinion, soon should actually come to an end because the public health emergency has really ended. And therefore, what do you do with all these, the masses who are flooding the border? Without Remain in Mexico as basically a backstop, the administration will have to essentially start letting those more and more hundreds of thousands into the country. And the Biden administration argued that the shall detain is not a command because Congress has not provided the funding to detain all these people. And the may, therefore, the fact that it may detain them in Mexico is not really a requirement either. Now, the three, Justice Alito, Gorsuch, and Thomas, said in their opinion, no, shall means shall. And if you don't have the capacity to detain them, whatever Congress did or did not do, you are therefore required to hold them in Mexico and reinstate the Remain in Mexico policy. The others, 6, Amy Coney Barrett's dissent, but the others said that no, Congress may have plenary authority over immigration, but the administration, the president has broad power over foreign policy, and therefore the Remain in Mexico policy is somewhat related to foreign policy. The judiciary is not going to step on its toes and tell it what to do. And so therefore it ultimately upheld President Biden's rescission of the Remain in Mexico.
Another case this week we haven't talked about yet is Oklahoma v. Castro Huerta. And that involved whether a state can prosecute a non-Native American who commits a crime against a Native American in Native American reservation territory. And Kim, can you just give us a brief sense of what the stakes here were?
Sure. So this was a little bit of a cleanup from a prior case settled just a couple of years ago, I think in 2020, called McGirt, in which Justice Neil Gorsuch joined 4 members of the liberal wing. He has long had a particular interest in Native rights. He felt that there was a commitment of the United States government in terms of the promise of ancestral lands. And essentially with this opinion that he offered, he basically turned a massive part of Oklahoma back into a reservation system as such. And the conservatives on the court did warn that this would cause great chaos, particularly in terms of public safety and order. And indeed, we have had these growing problems in that because of the ruling, states are no longer allowed to engage in prosecutions on native lands. That has meant that the feds have had to come in. They are overwhelmed. There are not nearly enough federal resources to deal with what is essentially the policing of 30,000 square miles. So this was a case that was brought that it made the case that state authorities should nonetheless have the ability to prosecute non-natives who commit crimes against natives on these lands. It dealt with a very, very tragic, horrible story of a man who was not native who allowed severe child neglect. And essentially the court kind of did a little bit of cleanup and agreed that, yes, the state does have authority to do that. It's not a reversal of this, but it is a little bit of it's a shout out too, by the way, to Amy Coney Barrett. That decision that was done, the original McGirt decision, she was not yet on the court. The fact that this was cleaned up at all is solely the fact that she now sits there.
One last thought as we cap off this historic Supreme Court term. We have a letter here from a listener, Ethan. And he says that Justice Antonin Scalia's opinion in the 1992 abortion case Planned Parenthood v. Casey, where he said that the Supreme Court was not going to be able to settle such a controversial issue nationwide, Ethan says that seems to have been vindicated. And then he adds, I wonder just how hopeful you think we can be about the ability of the democratic process to resolve differences in value judgments of this magnitude. He adds that the judicial branch has failed to resolve it, but will the legislative branch succeed? What comparably sized divides in value judgments has a democratic society managed to resolve through the democratic process? And Alicia, I think that's a reasonable question. I mean, there are all sorts of other issues that people feel very strongly about, including gun control versus gun rights, and yet they still play out through the legislative process in Congress and in the states.
I think that's right. I don't know if we, quote unquote, ever resolve these. I don't know if we ever reach a completely large democratic consensus, on same-sex marriage. I think that's somewhat surprisingly different because I don't think anyone saw, back in the Obergefell Supreme Court case, essentially legalizing same-sex marriage throughout the country, was decided that there would be, by this time, 70% of the country would support the legal or the constitutional right to same-sex marriage. But I think there are a lot of issues that we wouldn't necessarily, a lot of people don't think as value judgments or value issues that actually do involve deeply held values. And that could even include climate change. I mean, I think that has actually become a very moral issue, so to speak, for the left. State budgets, there is a lot of wrangling over, how much Medicaid, how much to provide for, quote unquote, the safety net programs, as well as schools. These are political differences that do implicate values, maybe perhaps not as much so as abortion. But yes, we managed to deal with these through the legislative process, and voters, if they don't like what their elected leaders do, they can vote them out, or they can move to another state.
And Kim, we'll give you the last word, but what's your take on this? I think I've said this before, but one hopeful thought is that it may reinvigorate some of these debates at the state and local levels. There are a lot of people who don't know who their local state legislators are, even though they follow national politics very closely. And that's because a lot of these issues have been nationalized. And if we push them back down to the states, maybe you get more debates between people in the same town, neighbors. And those are a little bit calmer and easier to resolve, I think, than having San Francisco try to debate Georgia, red states versus blue states.
It's so funny you should say this. Every time I go out and sit on a panel or give a speech and there are questions, everyone always says, what can we do? Washington just feels so broken. And this is always my refrain to them is, it's great that you watch Fox and that you care so much, but go out and get engaged in your local school board election. Know who your state representative is, your state senator, and focus on the laws there, because the reality is a couple of things. First of all, what those bodies are doing far more affect most people's day-to-day life than anything in Washington. I mean, I always ask people, what law has Congress passed recently that sort of really directly affects your life? Now, sadly, there are more of them that are coming out, healthcare is an example, for instance, but the people that are making the rules about when your garbage gets picked up and how much your local taxes you pay and how your child is educated, they are all right there at your doorstep. And I also remind people, and this is kind of like a happy note to go off on as we head into July 4th, is especially if you are a conservative, remember too that this was how the founders wanted it to be. Those government officials closest to you were always meant to be your real elected representative, your closest form of government, which is why we are a republic of 50 states. We do not want the federal government dealing with most of these issues. And one of the best ways to do that is make sure that you have very strong state governments that maintain their rights and don't cede more power to the feds.
Thank you, Kim and Alicia. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast app. Have a great 4th of July, everyone, and we'll be back next week on Tuesday with another edition of Potomac Watch.